All right, good morning and welcome to Iowa Environmental Council's annual conference and the first annual Iowa Environmental Education Week. My name is Sarah Green, and I'm the Executive Director for the Iowa Environmental Council. As Iowa's land, climate, and water continue to change, we see a need for enhanced dialogue and education about the environmental and health issues facing our communities today and for generations to come. These issues impact every single one of us and everyone else outside of these walls today. It's about the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, and the land we live, work, and play on. It's about fair and just access to resources and the ability to live in a safe, healthy community. If you live in or care about Iowa, this conference today is for you, and we're so glad that you're here with us today. Because it takes all of us working together to make a difference, and the time is now. I'm excited to share that next year, IEC will celebrate its 30th anniversary, with more than 100 member organizations and over 1,000 individuals, families, and households. We are the state's largest environmental coalition. Our work is informed by science, data, and stories. We educate, advocate, and provide sound science and policy direction on clean energy, water quality, land stewardship, climate change, and environmental justice initiatives. IEC's greatest strength is our relationships, within our team and within our diverse coalition. And this room today is evidence of the strong partnerships in our coalition. I'm thrilled to partner this year with Drake University and the Harkin Institute for Public Policy and Citizen Engagement for the first ever Iowa Environmental Education Week. Today's conference is just one in a series of events for experts, advocates, students, organizers, and anyone who cares about our environment. These events provide opportunities not only to point out challenges, but to define and move forward solutions for equity, for change, and for meaningful progress. To see all of our events, you can visit our website, iowaenvironmentaleducationweek.com. I'd like to extend our deepest gratitude for all of the sponsors who are listed out in the gallery, all of the staff members, individuals, and board members who made this event happen today. Please give everyone that's been involved a round of applause. In particular, I'd like to lift up Adam Schreiber of the Harkin Institute for his partnership in making this week happen. A special thank you as well to Drake University for supporting our work and providing the space for us to gather today.
First of all, I want to thank IEC for the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker today. As Dr. Winchester mentioned, I am the CEO at Flint Water Crisis. I've been doing that. I've been with the Water Crisis for a number of years and very interested in the topic today of our keynote today. I have spent my entire career in the drinking water industry, and I can tell you all that the drinking water industry's perspective on lead service lines has changed dramatically in the last 4 decades. From we know they're there, but they're not hurting anybody, so leave well enough alone, in the 80s when I started, to holy cow, these things are a liability, we have to replace them all. It's a new perspective today. And largely that transition happened because of what happened in Flint, Michigan. This is a challenge that's very near and dear to my heart because we have here in the city of Des Moines as many as 20,000 lead water service lines that are still in service, are still serving customers today. And it's important to note that we don't have a lead and drinking water problem in Des Moines, but we do have a lead water service line problem in Des Moines. That is a $200 million challenge for Des Moines Water Works, with very little, if any, funding available. So it's a big challenge for the country. It's a big challenge for the utility, and it's a big challenge for some of our customers who individually, personally own those lead service lines. And we're anticipating that EPA is going to require replacement of all of those service lines over a 10-year period, starting in about 2027. So, interesting topic, very interesting to me, certainly. Des Moines Water Works is pleased to present the keynote address today. Flint Fights Back, Environmental Justice and Democracy in the Flint Water Crisis, with Dr. Benjamin Pauli. Dr. Pauli is Associate Professor of Social Science at Kettering University in Flint, Michigan. He is the author of a book with the same name as the keynote address, Flint Fights Back, Environmental Justice and Democracy in the Flint Water Crisis, which was published by the MIT Press. Dr. Pauli is also president of the board of the Environmental Transformation Movement of Flint, acting chair of the Flint Water System Advisory Council, and a representative of the academic community on the EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. His interests include issues of water and trust, water governance, environmental justice, and principles of engagement and collaboration in community-based research. It was a great pleasure to meet you earlier this morning. Welcome and thank you for being here, Dr. Pauli.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much, Ted, for that generous introduction, and thanks to the Iowa Environmental Council for the invitation to deliver this address and kick off what promises to be an interesting and informative and productive day of conversation about some important issues. And thanks to all of you for being here bright and early. I have to admit that this is only my second time ever in Iowa, and the last time I was here, my family was mostly passing through on a longer road trip. But we did have a little time to, to hunt for Devonian-era fossils outside of Iowa City. I'm sure it sounds like some people know the site here. And we had an opportunity to imagine Iowa as a shallow sea teeming with marine life. So here I am, back in Iowa, thinking about water again. And I know I'm officially here to talk about Flint, but I've spent some time over the past few months trying to learn more about what water means in this place to the life forms now living here. And in my search for information, I could not help but come across the #1 Iowa book on Goodreads, which is, of course, the immortal classic, Dewey the Small Town Library Cat Who Touched the World. Tell you that some of you may already be familiar with Dewey, but if you're not, Dewey's full name is Dewey Read More Books, you'll notice. And this book asks the question, how many lives can one cat touch? The answer to which I have to assume is quite a few, but honestly I didn't get to that part. I did, however, read an enthralling chapter chronicling Dewey's battle with constipation. Spoiler alert, he has what's called a distended feline colon, which I'm sure is a phrase you were not expecting to hear this morning. In this context, though, the subject of Dewey's water consumption comes up, and it so happens that they cannot get Dewey to drink from his water dish at all. And interestingly, the authors, and yes, it did take 2 people to write this book, make a special point of noting that bottled water was not really an option yet in small town Iowa. This is the mid-90s we're talking about. So in short, they got to try to convince Dewey to drink tap water. And they try all kinds of strategies. They give it to him warm, they give it to him cold, they give it to him with ice out of different faucets, they refresh it every 5 minutes, but nothing seems to be working. Now there's a punchline to this story, but I'm going to save it for now. So if you already know, don't tell. Because I want to linger on the central predicament here. We have a creature being presented with water that the humans involved are insisting is good water. and it seems like it would benefit the creature greatly to drink said water. And all kinds of strategies are used to try to convince it to drink, but it's still not happening. And it strikes me that something not too different is going on in communities all over this country these days. We've got people working at our water utilities who I'm sure are for the most part good, competent people who take their job seriously, who believe deeply in the modern tap water ideal. They're convinced that the water they're offering their customers is a high quality product, which has the advantage also of being cheap and accessible. They believe it would be very much in people's interests to use this product rather than paying a premium for alternatives. And all kinds of, and they're trying in various ways to present us, this water to us in an appealing manner. And it's not always generating the intended reaction, especially now that we are living in an era where alternatives to the tap abound. As I'm sure you know, consumption of bottled water is on the rise. Bottled water companies are proving to be quite successful at convincing the public to purchase their far more expensive, environmentally unsustainable, self-monitored product. If we're imagining the consumer as a rational actor, their choice to drink something other than tap water looks about as mystifying as cat behavior, maybe. But why not drink the water that's right in front of you? Well, in addition to the seductive marketing of the bottled water industry, it's now pretty widely agreed that a major contributing factor to this phenomenon is an overall decline in trust. Trust not only in tap water itself, but in the institutions responsible for sourcing it, treating it, distributing it, regulating it, and monitoring it. And this decline was evident before the Flint Water Crisis came along, but in recent accounts of the simultaneous rise of tap water skepticism and bottled water consumption, Flint looms very large. It's seen as having substantially exacerbated that trend, resulting in a kind of contagion of distrust across communities that you see illustrated on the right here. And I think there's a lot about this phenomenon that's very frustrating to drinking water providers. I've had the opportunity to serve on a couple of work groups under the National Drinking Water Advisory Council at the EPA, and these groups have included water utility folks from all over the country. And almost inevitably, whatever our official topic was, Flint would come up. And maybe you've had that experience too, if a meeting's about over and nobody's mentioned Flint yet, so they better do that quick. But often when we would talk about Flint, these utility folks would resist the generalizability of Flint. In their view, the Flint Water Crisis was an exceptional case. So it might help us to learn something about worst case scenarios, but they didn't want anybody to think that the failures in Flint reflected widespread practices or institutional limitations found across the water industry, or heaven forbid, within their own water systems. So I developed some understanding, I think, of that point of view. But I also think that a big part of the reason why Flint does get brought up constantly is that it raised a whole host of issues extending far beyond just water that we do find in some form or other in other communities as well. And for me, it's been an incredible portal through which to investigate those broader issues. And people have derived all kinds of lessons from it. In the book that was mentioned earlier, I list at least some of these lessons. Flint has been seen as a wake-up call about the persistence of lead in the urban environment, especially lead in water, of course. An illustration of the dilapidation and underfunding of America's infrastructure, a revelation of the inadequacy of environmental regulatory frameworks, particularly the lead and copper rule, an indictment of the bureaucratic cultures that work against effective regulatory intervention, a dramatization of nationwide controversies about the treatment of poor people of color, a landmark environmental justice struggle demonstrating the power of grassroots activists to make change, a gold standard of citizen science, illustrating the potential of resident-driven scientific research to aid marginalized communities, And finally, an example of the dangers of aggressive state intervention into local affairs and the suspension of local democracy. We can't possibly go down all of those rabbit holes today, so instead, what I propose to do is something simpler. I know that for most people, Flint may have faded from the headlines long ago, and at this point, even the general contour of the crisis might be a little fuzzy, so I apologize if I end up telling you things you already know, but I wanted to offer at least a little memory refresher about how the crisis unfolded. I'd then like to bring things up to date and talk a little bit about where the crisis recovery effort stands today. And then finally, I'd like to talk about what's next, what kinds of reforms the crisis has helped to inspire, and what's on the horizon. And of course, we're going to be on the lookout for connections between Flint and Iowa. And any connections I try to make should be seen as very tentative. I'm very ready and willing to be further educated or re-educated as appropriate by all of you. But I think I'm in good company in looking for these connections. Some of you may remember that back in 2016, when the water crisis was getting a lot of headlines, somebody by the name of Chris Kolb accepted an invite from the IEC to speak here. He at the time was the president of the Michigan Environmental Council and co-chair of the Flint Water Advisory Task Force, which was created by then Governor Rick Snyder to investigate the crisis. And what you're seeing here is an excerpt from an op-ed he wrote around the time of the visit. So I'll just read through it if you don't mind. He said, "I've come to the conclusion that what happened in Flint can happen anywhere policymakers take clean water for granted and neglect to make appropriate investments to preserve and support safe drinking and recreational waters. As Iowans well know, the failure to prioritize funding for clean water is hardly unique to Flint. Adequate, sustainable, long-term funding is essential to address water-related challenges, be they from aging infrastructure like in Flint or from the high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution threatening drinking and recreational waters in Iowa." And I know that people have also spent some time looking from Iowa to Flint for some of these same kinds of connections. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here. Throughout most of the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st, Flint got its drinking water through a Detroit-owned and operated regional water system that drew mainly from Lake Huron. Over the years, the water relationship between these two cities grew somewhat strained, and some local political figures hatched a plan to build a new pipeline to Lake Huron, over which Flint and neighboring communities would have more control. When Flint announced that it would be switching to this pipeline once it was finished, it caused even more controversy with Detroit, and it was eventually decided that rather than trying to reconcile, Flint would get its water from the Flint River, at least in the short term. That switch was made in April 2014, and it turned out the city was not prepared to treat that river water properly. A series of treatment missteps introduced various forms of instability into the water system, wildly fluctuating chlorine levels, higher corrosivity. Some residents started noticing changes to the color, the taste, the smell of the water, as well as changes to their bodies after coming into contact with the water. In late summer, the detection of coliform bacteria in the system led to multiple boil water advisories. In October, General Motors, which as you may know got its start in Flint and still has some operational facilities there, got special permission to disconnect from Flint water because it found the water was damaging its engine parts. In January of the next year, so this is 2015 now, residents were informed that Flint was in violation of the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, not because of lead, because of high levels of carcinogenic chlorine disinfection byproducts. By that time, residents experiencing issues with the water had already begun to find each other and to strategize about what to do. But it was this notice of the violation that really got people out into the streets. So over the next several months, Flint residents rallied and marched and petitioned and filed lawsuits, and in various ways tried to sound the alarm about the water and force the city to abandon use of the river. the public outcry about the water was strong enough that the Flint City Council voted to do all things necessary to reconnect to Detroit Water. But it was overruled, because at that time, in fact, from 2011 to 2015, there was just one person in charge of Flint, a state-appointed emergency manager, who had ostensibly been put in place to help the city out of financial crisis. This emergency manager called the city council's vote incomprehensible. So the activists tried another tack. After high levels of lead were discovered at a few homes in early 2015, they teamed up with some engineer helpers and collected almost 300 water samples, demonstrating in the process that Flint had a systemic lead in water problem. After evidence emerged that lead was finding its way into the bloodstreams of the city's children, officials finally conceded that there was a public health threat, and in October, they finalized a deal to get Flint back onto Detroit's water system. But at that point, the damage to the pipes, to public health, to trust had been done. And so that was really just the end of part one of the struggle. And part two, what I'm calling the recovery effort, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is still very much ongoing. Now, this is a pretty bare bones account, but one thing I've tried to highlight in my work is that even when we try to stick to the basic facts of the crisis, we are always making choices about what to put in, what to leave out, what to emphasize, and so on. And these choices matter not just because they influence our understanding of what happened, but because they shape the significance we see in the crisis and how we respond to it. I've tried to identify a few especially influential narratives of the water crisis that are in circulation out there. I'll just run through them briefly here. What I call the technical narrative spotlights the water treatment missteps I mentioned, the interaction of water chemistry and infrastructure, the failure of certain engineers to quote-unquote do their jobs. And from this perspective, the main issues to address in Flint are issues like water corrosivity, infrastructural weaknesses, and the exploitation of monitoring loopholes, this kind of thing. The historical narrative pushes the origins of the crisis way back beyond 2014 into Flint's deep history and tries to weave together all of the various historical factors that made Flint vulnerable in the first place. Things like deindustrialization, racial discrimination, white flight, a shrinking tax base, and so on. It suggests that solving the Flint water crisis and preventing others like it requires addressing the so-called urban crisis, the many historically rooted systemic problems that are preventing our cities from functioning properly. Finally, what I call the political narrative centers the political actors and ideologies that contributed to the crisis, particularly that system of emergency management that I mentioned earlier, which essentially allowed for unelected autocrats to make crucial decisions about Flint's water, in addition to a whole range of other things. So this narrative asks us to imagine what might have been different if Flint residents, or even just their elected representatives, had more of a say in decision-making during the relevant time period. It suggests that it was poisoned democracy that led to poisoned water. Another important feature of these narratives is that they treat different people or groups as their main characters, determining not only who gets the most attention, but who gets the most blame for causing the problems, and who gets the most credit for solving them. For example, the technical narrative tends to tends to make antagonists out of those engineers who messed up, and subsequently try to cover their tracks, and protagonists out of the technical experts, and to some extent their community helpers, who tried to sound the alarm about lead in water and blood. The political narrative, by contrast, makes villains out of those seen as the enemies of democracy, and celebrates the community members who took things into their own hands and fought their own fight. From my perspective as a resident of Flint from the summer of 2015 on, that community part of the story was not always getting enough attention. It became clear to me fairly quickly that the community mobilization around the crisis was impressive and impactful. And that mobilization involved a lot of people, most of whose names you probably have never heard. Because as the crisis became big news, a strong tendency emerged within the coverage of it to tell you, to focus on a handful of quote-unquote heroes. This compilation of Bridge magazine coverage promises to tell you about the heroes who fought back, as its subtitle puts it. But the picture that it offers of the heroes shows 4 people, 3 of whom are non-resident technical experts of one kind or another. And that's not to say that their contributions weren't important, but by characterizing heroism in this way, my feeling was that we were starting to run the risk of perpetuating another kind of, perpetrating another kind of injustice. An injustice in our distribution of attention, and credit, and status, and influence. Heaping praise and awards and so forth on the technical expert helpers had the effect of giving them mostly unquestioned authority to speak about the crisis, even when what they were saying was controversial, or wrong, or simply incomplete, which later on in various ways led to the marginalization of community voices within the recovery effort. So I see that political, democracy-centric narrative as a lens that can offer a useful corrective to this kind of phenomenon by putting resident perspectives and the collective action of community members at the center of the story. So let's carry that story forward now into the recovery effort and highlight as we go along some of the differences of perspective between experts and officials and community members when it comes to how much progress we've made in Flint. I think there's a widespread belief on the expert and official side of things, that yes, terrible mistakes were made in Flint, and some harm was done, but probably not as much harm as a lot of people think. And after the problems were acknowledged, there was an extraordinary, in some ways unparalleled and unprecedented mobilization around the crisis, resulting in assistance and resources that Flint was very fortunate to receive. When viewed this way, the crisis response could be understood as a kind of success story, at least relative to the stories of many other communities that don't receive any help at all, or at least not nearly on the Flint scale. Looking at the recovery effort from the community side, however, can teach us something important about how even an unusually vigorous attempt to help by government agencies, nonprofits, academics, concerned citizens, etc., can still fall significantly short of what the people impacted might see as a just or even an adequate outcome. And I think we can illustrate this by looking at a number of different aspects of the recovery effort. And I'm not sure why I felt the need to be alliterative on this slide. I'm sorry about that. I've got a bunch of R's going on here. But starting with research. As time has gone on, we've learned more about the likely impact of the crisis as more data has come in. And by some accounts, that data has been reassuring. There are some researchers who are arguing that the harm done by lead was not nearly what it's been made out to be. Now there's ongoing debate about the extent of that harm. But even if that rosy interpretation is true, let's recall that the crisis was always about much more than just lead. In 2016, we learned that while Flint was on the river, it suffered a historic outbreak of Legionnaire's disease, caused by waterborne Legionella bacteria, which took the lives of numerous people. And later on, we learned that the death toll from Legionnaires may have gone well beyond the official statistics. And arguably, just on this level, just talking about Legionnaires, we're talking about one of the worst water-related public health disasters in recent American history. So while the news hasn't been all bad, what we've learned about impact has in some ways been worse, not better than feared. And certainly that's contributed to the widespread community view that there are other kinds of impacts which maybe are not being fully accounted for and could also be worse than what's been officially acknowledged. On the resources front, Residents and their political allies did successfully push for hundreds of millions of dollars of state and federal aid. And in this respect, you could say that Flint is indeed more fortunate than a lot of other communities. On the other hand, it's been estimated that addressing Flint's infrastructure issues in a truly comprehensive way would cost as much as $4.7 billion. And even just with respect to lead-bearing infrastructure, we still don't have enough money to get it all out. How about reparations for the harm suffered by residents? Not just the physical harm, but the mental harm, the material harm. Well, a class action lawsuit led to a sizable settlement, including $600 million from the state of Michigan. Another sum that looks very impressive on paper, perhaps. But as some of us pointed out in a commentary in the journal Environmental Justice, a third of this settlement is going to lawyers. Adult residents who don't have paperwork proving physical harm from the water, which is a lot of people, will probably get no more than $1,000 or $2,000. And not a single resident has seen one penny yet. Some have died waiting. And for them, justice delayed is literally justice denied. How about restoration of our water quality? Well, if we're measuring that by compliance with federal standards, Flint is in pretty good shape. For example, it has stayed mostly, although not entirely, in compliance with the federal lead and copper rules since 2016. But one of the things we've learned from this experience is that there can be huge differences between water quality system-wide and water quality in any given home. We still have residents getting their water through lead pipes. And many residents won't even consider referring to the water as safe until we get that lead out of the ground. Beyond that, though, there are other kinds of water quality threats that we face. During our water system's latest sanitary survey, the state found, quote, significant deficiencies within our distribution system that, and quoting, represent an immediate health risk to consumers of water, particularly the lack of a plan to prevent backflow of contaminated water, which is a plan that we have in fact lacked for many years. And it's not clear what kinds of consequences that might be having for our water quality. How about reconstruction of our damaged infrastructure? Well, we've made a lot of progress getting lead service lines out at residences. This is the hole in front of my house. Back in 2017, they never fixed my yard, by the way. Still waiting on that. Beyond these, it's the case that we still have more work to do. We're still not done. There have been many unnecessary delays with those replacements. And beyond replacing those service lines at residences, there are lines at non-residential buildings, there's damaged internal plumbing, there are many water mains that are still in need of replacement. And in the background of all of this is a water utility that's really limited in its capacity to address these issues and to ensure that we remain in compliance with federal standards, which is why our system is still under EPA oversight all these years later. There's another big part of this puzzle, and that's accountability. As you might have heard, the crisis led to some very serious criminal charges being filed against a range of government officials, from some of those lower-level engineers, all the way up to former Governor Rick Snyder. And it would take a separate keynote address to take you through all the ins and outs associated with these charges. But suffice to say that after years of waiting for anyone to stand trial for their role in the water crisis, Flint residents instead saw all of these charges thrown out on procedural grounds. And we're past the statute of limitations now, so that's the end of that. And you can expect that the reverberations of outrage and betrayal will linger within the community for a long time. This is seen as a glaring piece of evidence that the system is not in fact committed to doing right by Flint residents. So, notable progress in Flint? Yes, but nevertheless, a persistent gap between the most we've been able to achieve and what people feel they have every right to expect. But of course, the story of the Flint water crisis doesn't end with Flint. As mentioned earlier, its reverberations have been felt far and wide, and it has helped to trigger a variety of institutional and cultural changes elsewhere. So in the last part of my talk, I'd like to look at some of these developments and encourage all of us to think about whether they represent an effective and adequate response to the kinds of issues raised by Flint. So following up first on that topic of lead and water. Flint inspired some significant changes to our state lead and copper rule, and we're starting to see similar policies adopted by other states and at the federal level. Notably, our updated rule requires an inventory of service lines across the state so that we actually know what's under the ground and who might be threatened by it and where we should be digging. And we're now seeing that inventory requirement go nationwide. The rule also requires complete rather than partial replacement of lead service lines. Partial replacements can actually exacerbate lead contamination. Unfortunately, we are not going far enough at the federal level to make sure that this is the case everywhere. But in some respects, the feds are going even further than what we've seen thus far in Michigan. So our rule aims to have all going too fast. Lead service lines out of the ground in 20 years. EPA is lowering that to 10 for most communities, so that's significant. In Michigan, we dropped our action level for lead down to 12 parts per billion from 15. EPA is dropping it further to 10. The practice of sampling, not just the first liter at the tap, but the 5th liter, which gives us a fuller picture of lead contamination, has also been embraced by EPA. And another area where Michigan is ahead of the feds is by requiring that every utility serving at least 50,000 people has a water system advisory council, like the one that I chaired in Flint. And this is really an outgrowth of the fact that during those 18 months we were on the river in Flint, residents were not getting good information about their water, and they were not getting follow-up on their concerns. These councils are supposed to represent an effort to create a trusted medium of communication between utilities and those they serve, which in theory could help to democratize water management by giving community members more say over priorities and over decision-making. I think there's some real potential there, but I will say just based on our experience in Flint with our own Water Advisory Council, we're still facing this challenge where the folks who are actually running the water system day to day don't necessarily think they need our help in doing that. I think their belief is that they have a pretty good sense of what their job is and how to do it. And so they don't always see the value in engaging with community members in that kind of cooperative back and forth way. So that's something we are still working on. But again, I do think there's potential there. Flint also helped to inspire the passage of so-called filter first legislation in Michigan, which requires all schools and child care centers to proactively install lead-reducing filters at taps used for drinking and cooking, rather than waiting around to get high lead sample results. That kind of proactive public health protection doesn't always come naturally to us here in the United States. We like to poison people first, and then maybe later we admit the error of our ways and try to change. And it's not clear to me that EPA is ever going to embrace the filter first model. From what I can tell, they're worried about giving people the impression that they should be filtering their tap water as a matter of course, as a precaution. They're afraid that's going to scare even more people away from the tap and onto bottled water. The status quo, though, is that EPA is deeply complicit in giving people the impression that because their water utility is in compliance, because their annual water quality report says everything's A-okay, that means the water in their home or their school is safe. And it does not mean that. So EPA still has some work to do on its own messaging and approach to this issue. But in the meantime, perhaps we'll see legislators in other states, say maybe the state of Iowa, take up filter first, as some folks well known to the IEC have been advocating for around here. I want to turn now to another area of reform, namely the increasing institutionalization of environmental justice. The Flint Water Crisis was, of course, held up as a paradigmatic example of environmental injustice by a great many people, including no less an authority. Oops, I had one more clip to go there. Sorry. Including by no less an authority than Iowa State alum Robert Bullard. Now, as I'm sure you know, the environmental justice movement has been around for a long time. And prior to Flint, there had been some not insignificant moves to try to build environmental justice into our institutions of government. So at the federal level, this would include the creation within EPA of the Office of Environmental Equity, which was later renamed the Office of Environmental Justice, the establishment of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, or NEJAC, as we affectionately call it. Clinton's executive order requiring all federal agencies to promote environmental justice in their work, and the formation of an interagency work group on EJ, as I will now refer to environmental justice. But despite all of this, the federal government was not really delivering what EJ activists were looking for most of all. It was not empowering them to take control of their own environment and prevent others from further degrading it. And the litmus test issue here has always been the control over the siting of hazardous and polluting facilities, which is the issue that touched the EJ movement off in the first place, back in Warren County, North Carolina. The failure to move the needle on that front was illustrated in two precedent-setting cases that came out of, where else? Flint, Michigan. Back in the 90s, a group of Flint activists, working with legal allies, pioneered the use of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to try to prevent construction of a polluting facility. In this case, a wood-burning incinerator that was to be sited in a predominantly poor African-American area, which already contained a bunch of other polluting facilities. The activists argued that the facility would have a disparate impact on groups that are protected under civil rights law. That complaint fell into what became an infamous black hole at EPA, where over the next 2 decades, many civil rights complaints went to languish without follow-up. So that was kind of the first precedent that was established here. The second precedent was that when complaints were decided, they were dismissed. And that's what happened to the second complaint filed by this group, which aimed to block the construction of a steel mill. And the rationale that was given for the dismissal of that complaint was very influential and instructive. EPA argued that if a company could show that its facility would comply with existing environmental laws, it would be by definition in compliance with civil rights law as well, even if it did negatively impact protected groups. Even if people in the area were already burdened by many other forms of environmental contamination. So that was a pretty big blow to people who were looking for redress from federal agencies. And in the ensuing years, even within EPA, EJ's presence remained pretty tokenistic. The EJ office was pretty marginalized and under-resourced. As we'll see in a moment, things have changed. And what I want to suggest is that the Flint Water Crisis helped to create a kind of cultural tipping point that finally brought environmental justice into something like the mainstream. And this helped generate a lot of pressure to change. All of a sudden, everybody was on the lookout for the next Flint. And before long, you started seeing articles like these proclaiming that environmental justice was finally having its moment. And there were, of course, other events that accelerated this trend. I think the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement also deserve mention here for putting that issue of racial injustice front and center, and creating a cultural expectation that we all look for ways of getting on the right side of that issue. Now in Michigan, we already had a very strong environmental justice tradition, consciousness, network, but even we didn't have much to show for all of that within our institutions of government. Now, all of a sudden, we have a state EJ advisory council. We have state-sponsored EJ conferences. We have the state office of the EJ public advocate and a state EJ mapping tool. And this kind of stuff seems to be happening all over the place now, or at least in many parts of the country. I came across this interesting scorecard, which is attempting to show just how institutionalized EJ is, state by state, across the Midwest and the Northeast. By these criteria, anyway, you can see that there are several states that are actually further ahead than Michigan. Iowa, as you can see, has a little catching up to do. But this is from 2022. Maybe some of this has changed. I know there's going to be an EJ in Iowa panel after this, so I'm sure we'll learn something from that. How about institutionalization of EJ at the federal level? Well, in recent years, we've seen the same kind of dam breaking open. We saw the elevation of the status of the Office of Environmental Justice within EPA, and we saw money flooding into that office like never before. We saw the announcement of Justice 40, which probably needs no introduction, but in short, is aimed at ensuring that federal resources benefit EJ communities and other marginalized communities. We have a new White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, or WEJAC. In fact, WEJAC and NEJAC are about to have their first joint public meeting in Alabama in a couple of weeks. So we're putting the Jacks together. So we have a WEJAC, and we now have an EJ scorecard tracking the EJ efforts of all federal agencies. And we could go on. How about that EJ holy grail, though? The ability to control environmental quality within one's own community and to block harmful and undesired projects. Well, we're seeing some intriguing experiments on the state level, in places like New Jersey, at the local level, in places like Newark, Minneapolis, Chicago, to require permitting agencies to use a fuller range of criteria in their decision-making, to consider the cumulative impacts of various chemical and non-chemical stressors when making permitting decisions. This means looking at pollution in context and whether new facilities will exacerbate already disproportionate burdens. My understanding is that here in Iowa, a cumulative impact assessment tool is now being used in RCRA permitting. So we'll see how many permits actually get denied on these grounds. That's kind of the ultimate litmus test. But these are some interesting developments at the very least. What about the prospect of using civil rights law to block permits on the grounds of discrimination? Well, EPA Administrator Michael Regan came into office pledging to reinvigorate, or maybe invigorate is a better word, civil rights enforcement at EPA. And Flint activists once again spearheaded one of the most notable test cases. A couple years back, they filed a new Title VI complaint, this time against a proposed asphalt plant that was going to be built in that same overpolluted area we mentioned earlier. This time around, in addition to an ostensibly receptive EPA, there was a new regime in place at the Michigan Department of the Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, or EGLE, which used to be called the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. It was rebranded after the Flint Water Crisis. And so there was some hope that that office too had been reformed. EPA brought these complaints to the table with EGLE to try to broker an agreement. Justice world, where on paper we've managed to make some fairly significant strides, some communities are already having the experience of being let down once again by these supposedly reformed institutions, which are still coming up well short of what people were hoping for and expecting. With that institutional context, in mind, I want to return to our earlier discussion of the individual encounter with the glass or dish of water, and the choice of to drink or not to drink. And I apologize, you've been holding your breath for almost an hour waiting to hear what explains our friend Dewey's tap water aversion. Perhaps he was aware of a Safe Drinking Water Act violation or something of that nature. Nope, it turns out that he was finding his way into the library bathroom and guzzling toilet water the whole time. So he was quite satisfied with that. In other words, he was opting, in the manner of an irrational actor, for what would seem to be an objectively inferior means of getting his water. Now, when Homo sapiens do the same, not drink out of the toilet, but opt for supposedly objectively inferior ways of getting their water, we could blame it on a kind of pathology of distrust, stemming from fears that have to some extent been manufactured or inflated by bottled water advertising, scary headlines coming out of Flint, and so forth. And it's possible that that is a big part of the explanation. But this framing of the issue kind of implies that there aren't terribly good defensible reasons for the distrust. That there's still a kind of regrettable mistake being made. I, along with some of my colleagues, have argued that we might benefit from flipping things around and talking about the trustworthiness of the people and institutions asking for trust. When we do that, we find that regardless of their intentions and motivations, in practice there are many promises that these people and institutions make that they can't really fully deliver on. Perhaps if we were more open and honest about their limitations, people wouldn't swing all the way in the direction of total distrust when there are letdowns. And we'd be able to have a more constructive conversation about how we can address those limitations. So I think the Flint Water Crisis has been and will remain a productive portal, as I put it, through which we can productively examine issues like this. Issues that get at the heart of our relationship, not only to our most intimate environments and the substances we put into our bodies, but to each other and our social institutions. If you'll allow me a slightly poetic way of making that last point, I'd like to return through the book and read just a bit of the conclusion. Water has a way of encouraging us to think about society at its most elemental level. The provision of clean, safe water is one of the cornerstones of civilization, a precondition of everything else that human beings have achieved or can achieve. More than with any other essential natural resource, accessing water depends upon intricate forms of social coordination to transport it, to treat it, to sell it, to monitor its quality, to return it to nature after it has passed through human bodies and infrastructures. Our use of water depends also on whether or not, when told we can drink it by the authorities that watch over us, we believe. How we deliver clean, safe water, who is most likely to get it, and whether or not we feel we can trust it when it arrives may not tell us everything we need to know about the societies we live in, but tells us a great deal. When the water that we use to make our coffee and bathe our children is poisoned by policy, it is marked with the failures of our social institutions, and with the social injustices that force some more than others to bear the brunt of those failures. And sometimes the failures are so big, the injustices so glaring, that things actually change. And it may be that not enough has changed in the wake of Flint, and that there's always the risk, of course, of the pendulum swinging back. We might well wonder just how much we'll be able to accomplish within our current window of opportunity, but within this room today and beyond, we will all be part of rendering an answer to that question. Thank you.